It was the bloodiest week in Egypt since the Portside soccer massacre in February. With 3 weeks to go before the anticipated first round of presidential elections, the latest death toll has renewed public outrage toward the ruling military junta. A dozen people were killed when pro-government thugs attacked a sit-in outside the Ministry of Defense in the Abbaseya neighborhoods. Protesters refused to leave the sit-in. The military warned it would respond with force against anyone who advanced on the Ministry of Defense. As usual, Friday prayer was the prelude to a larger demonstration that would culminate in the afternoon outside the army barricades. The prayer at the Abbaseya sit-in was small in size, but emotional. Some of the protesters had lost friends and relatives in the bloody week of violence. Since Mubarak's ouster, the conservative Islamists, known as Salafis, had largely stayed away from street protests, instead participating in last November's parliamentary elections. Exceeding expectations, Salafi parties won a quarter of the seats of parliament. But when their preferred presidential candidate, Hazem Salah Abu Ismail, was disqualified 3 weeks ago, many Salafis hit the streets against the military council. Now the Salafis have joined revolutionaries from all walks of life, including liberals who have often been at odds with the Salafis. All coming together to battle government security forces, which have routinely attacked protesters since the ruling military junta came to power last year. After prayer, marches began arriving in Abbaseya, and the growing numbers of protesters moved toward the tenuous barbed wire barricade, fencing off the Ministry of Defense. The mood was tense. When a few protesters who jumped the barricade were beaten by soldiers, the violence began. Both sides hurled rocks at each other. Some of the protesters tried to stop the rock throwing, but their efforts were futile. Water cannons did little to fend off angry demonstrators. Protesters tore apart the construction site, using anything and everything to protect themselves from government forces. For a while, the rock battle was a standoff. Injured protesters were carried away, but others quickly replaced them. Military helicopters flew overhead. Both before and after Mubarak's ouster, the government relied on police and thugs to crush protests, portraying the military as a neutral force that is protecting the people. But this time, the lines were clearly drawn. Thousands of Egyptians, most from working-class backgrounds, faced off against a military government with a $4.6 billion annual budget for its armed forces. More than a quarter of that financed by the United States government. U.S. Secretary of State Hillary Clinton recently approved the $1.3 billion in annual military aid to Egypt's ruling generals. This, despite claims from human rights groups that Egypt's military junta, like the Mubarak regime, is brutalizing its people.
غاز شرطة متسمم غاز في سم احنا كنا في 28 مش كده ده بيولع لنا وشنا كله.
When the soldiers started firing tear gas, they gained the upper hand. The protesters were pushed back. Those that remained fighting were quickly overwhelmed by the barrage of tear gas pouring in from all directions.
They're coming. Let's get the fuck out. Let's get back.
After protesting and staging a sit-in in front of the Ministry of Defense for 7 days, the protesters were flushed out in a chaotic rush in a matter of minutes. Vendor stands and makeshift clinics were destroyed as thousands struggled to flee the area. The fallen included the elderly, the sick, the injured, women, children, and this woman's young infant.
We just got gassed out of the sit-in. Security forces released, I don't know, excessive amounts of tear gas on people, literally flushing the people out. I mean, it was terrible. It was a stampede and there were people falling everywhere. The clinics had no time to remove the injured people. And now we're outside the sit-in, which is incredibly dangerous for people who have been participating in the occupation. Because this place is a bastion for pro-government supporters.